of his will in one life that determines what a man will be in the next. Man is thus born in bodies that are shaped by his own will. So death is a mere physical change. The self does not die. Krishna again emphasizes the same imperishability of the soul.
Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavakah, na chainam kledayantyapo, na shoshayati marutah.
This self is neither pierced by weapons, nor burnt by fire, nor made damp by water, nor dried up by wind. Weapons cannot cleave the self. Fire cannot singe him. He cannot also be drenched by water, nor withered by wind.
Achedyo yamadayyoyam akledyo shoshaevacha Nitya sarvagatah sthanu achaloyam sanatanah.
The self, which cannot be pierced or burnt or made wet or faded, is uninterrupted, all-pervasive, constant, immovable, and eternal. The self cannot be cut or pierced through. He cannot be burnt, and he cannot be soaked. Even the whole firmament cannot contain him within its expanse. The self is beyond doubt, ever fresh, omnipresent, immovable, constant, and everlasting. Arjuna has pronounced family traditions to be eternal. So according to him, the war will destroy Sanatan Dharma itself. But Krishna finds it an example of ignorance and points out that the self alone is eternal. If we do not know the means by which we can realize our self and his goal, we have no inkling of Sanatan Dharma. India has paid a heavy price for this ignorance. We are so befogged by silly customs that we have lost the capacity to realize that food and touch cannot destroy Sanatan Dharma. The truth is that no object of the material world can touch this universal spiritual principle. What has made us in India lose millions of our brothers to conversion, to other religions, is not Dharma, but only some stupid conventions. And the same misconceptions must be held responsible for our worsening communal situation, partition of India, and even for the serious threats to our national unity and integrity that we are facing today. There are innumerable examples of how we have suffered because of our mindless customs that have nothing to do with Dharma. Dharma protects us and is therefore stronger than us. But whereas even the mortal body needs some kind of a weapon to be killed, the peculiar Dharma of the gullible Hindu was destroyed by a mere touch. What kind of Dharma was it, we wonder? For it is man-made customs which die, not that which is eternal and immutable. That which is eternal is so strong and impregnable that arms cannot pierce it, fire cannot burn it, and water cannot wet it. Nothing that belongs to the material world can touch it, let alone food and drink. Some such misguided traditions had prevailed at the time of Arjuna also, and he was obviously one of their victims. So he tearfully whines to Krishna about the eternal nature of family rites and customs. The war, he says, will destroy Sanatan Dharma, and when this is lost, all the members of the family are bound to end up in hell. It is evident that what Arjuna is talking about is some customary beliefs of his time. That is why the spiritually adept Krishna refutes him and points out that the self alone is perpetual. If we do not know the way to this embodied God, we are yet uninitiated into the spirit of Sanatan Dharma. Knowing that this immutable, eternal self pervades all, what should we look for? This is what Krishna speaks of now.
Avyaktoyamachintyoyam avikaryoyamuchyate tasmadevam viditvainam nanushochitumarhasi.
Knowing that the self is unmanifest, a non-object to the senses, incomprehensible because he is a non-object to the mind, and changeless, O Arjuna, it does not befit you to grieve over him. The soul is unmanifest and not an object of the senses. He cannot be grasped by the senses. He is present even when there is the association of senses with their objects, but he cannot be comprehended. He is beyond thought. He is eternal, and he is present even when the mind and its volitions persist. But he is beyond perception, enjoyment, and access. So the mind has to be restrained. Krishna has told Arjuna that the unreal has no existence, and neither is the real ever non-existent. The self is that reality. It is the self that is changeless, constant, eternal, and unmanifest. They who know the essence have found the self adorned with these traits. Not linguists, nor the affluent, but only seers have known the unique character of the self. In chapter 18, Krishna will affirm that the Supreme Spirit alone is real. By restraining the mind, the worshipper sees him and becomes one with him. At the moment of attainment, he realizes God, and the very next moment after this, he finds his own soul adorned with godlike traits. He sees then that this self is true, eternal, and perfect. This self is beyond the reach of thought. Free from any deviation, it is called immutable. Krishna then uses simple logic to demonstrate the contradictions between Arjuna's thoughts.
Atha chainam nityajatam nityam va manyase mritam tathapi tvam mahabaho naivam shochitumarhasi.
You ought not to grieve, O the mighty-armed, even if you think of him, the self, as ever born and ever dying. Arjuna ought not to mourn, even if he regards the self as constantly born and constantly dying.
Jatasya hi dhruvo mrityuh dhruvam janma mritasya cha tasmada pariharyerthe natvam shochitumarhasi.
Since this also proves the certain death of what is born and the certain birth of what dies, you ought not to grieve over the inevitable. Even the assumption that the self is ever born and ever dying only goes to establish that the born must die and the dead must be born. So Arjuna ought not to grieve over what must be, For sorrowing over something which is inevitable is inviting yet another sorrow.
Avyaktaadini bhutani vyaktamadhyani bharata avyaktanidhananyeva tatra ka paridevana.
Why grieve over the matter, O Bharat Arjun, when all beings disembodied before birth and disembodied after death appear to possess a body only between the two events? All beings are bodiless before birth and also bodiless after death. They can be seen neither before birth nor after death. It is only between birth and death that they assume the form of a body. So why grieve uselessly over this change? But who can see this self? Krishna answers the question thus.
Ascharyavat pashyati kaschidinam Ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanyah Ascharyavatchainamanya shrinoti Shrutvapyenam vedana chaiva kaschit.
Only a seer views the soul as a marvel. Another one describes him as a marvel, and yet another one hears him as a marvel, while there are some who hear him and yet know him not. Krishna has said before that only accomplished, enlightened sages have viewed the self. Now he elaborates the rareness of this vision. Only a rare sage sees the self, views him directly rather than just hears of him. Similarly, another rare sage speaks of his substance. Only he who has seen the self can describe him. Yet another rare seeker hears him as a wonder, for even hearing the voice of the self is not possible for all, because it is meant only for men of high spiritual attainment. There are people who hear the self and yet know him not, because they are incapable of treading the spiritual path. A man may listen to countless words of wisdom, split hairs, and be eager to acquire the highest wisdom, but his attachments are possessed of irresistible might, and after only a short while, he finds himself reversed to worldly business. So at last, Krishna gives his verdict.
Dehi nityam avadhyoyam Dehe sarvasya bharata Tasmat sarvani bhutani Natvam shochitumarhasi.
Since the self dwelling in all bodies is unslayable, O Bharat, it does not befit you to grieve for living beings. Arjun ought not to mourn for living beings, because the self, in whatever body he is, can be neither slain nor pierced through. Duly expounded and treated with authority, the point at issue that the self is eternal is concluded here. But there arises another question at this point: how to realize and fulfill the self? In the whole of the Gita, only two ways are suggested for this. First, the way of selfless action, Nishkam Karma Yoga. and secondly, the way of discernment, Jnana Yoga. The required action for both the ways is the same. Stressing the necessity of this action, Yogeshwar Krishna says,
Swadharmamapi chaveksha navikampitumurhasi dharmyadhiyuddha shreyonyat kshatriyasya na vidyate.
In view of your own dharma also, it is unworthy of you to fear, for there is nothing more propitious for a Kshatriya than a righteous war. It does not befit Arjuna to be hesitant, even if he just keeps his dharma in view, because there is no greater good for a Kshatriya than a war of piety. It has been repeatedly said that the self is immutable, that the self is eternal, and that the self is the only real dharma. Now, what is this dharma of the self? Swadharma. The self is the only dharma, although the capacity to engage in this dharma varies from individual to individual. This ability arising from one's disposition has been named Swadharma, or the inherent dharma. Ancient sages divided the travelers on the eternal path of the self into 4 classes: Shudra, Vaishya, Kshatriya, and Brahman, according to their innate abilities. In the primary stage of accomplishment, every seeker is a Shudra, meaning one who is deficient in knowledge. He spends hours on worship and adoration of God, and yet fails to render even 10 minutes of his time truly beneficial to his spiritual quest. He is unable to cut through the illusory facade of the material world. Sitting devoutly at the feet of an accomplished teacher at this stage helps in the cultivation of virtues in his nature. With this, he is promoted to the level of a seeker of the Vaishya class. Gradually realizing that accomplishments of the self are the only true accomplishments, he becomes adept in seizing and protecting his senses. Passion and wrath are fatal to the senses, whereas discrimination and renunciation protect them, but they are by themselves incapable of annihilating seeds of the material world. Gradually then, as the worshipper progresses further, his heart and mind grow strong enough to carve their way through the 3 properties of nature. This is the inborn quality of a Kshatri. At this point, the worshipper acquires the ability to destroy the world of nature and its perversions. So this is the point of commencement of the war. By further refinement after this, the worshipper is slowly elevated to the category of a Brahmin. Some of the virtues that now grow in the seeker are control of the mind and senses, incessant contemplation, simplicity, perception, and knowledge. By slowly perfecting these qualities, then, he ultimately attains to God, and at this stage he ceases to be even a Brahmin. At a sacrifice performed by Janak, king of Vidya, answering questions by Ushasti, Kahol, Aruni, Udalak, and Gargi, Maharshi Yagyavalkya said that a Brahmin is one who has achieved direct realization of the self. It is the self, dwelling in this world and the higher world, and in all beings, that governs all from within. The self is the inner ruler. The sun, the moon, the earth, water, ether, fire, stars, space, the sky, and every moment of time are under the authority of this self. This embodied self, knowing and controlling the mind and the heart from within, is immortal. He is the imperishable reality, Akshar, and anything that is not self is destroyed. In this world, he who offers oblations, performs sacrifices, practices austerities, even though for many thousands of years, but without an awareness of this reality, gains little. All his offerings and exercises are perishable. He who departs from this life without knowing the imperishable is like a wretched miser. But he who dies with knowledge of reality is a Brahmin. Arjuna is Kshatri worshipper. According to Krishna, there is no more beneficial way for such a seeker than war. The question is, what is meant by the term Kshatri? Usually, in social usage, it is taken as one of the terms such as Brahman, Vaishya, and Shudra, which are denomination of castes determined by birth. These four constitute what are known as the fourfold Varna. But that such was not the original intent behind the provision is evident from what the Gita has to say about the inherent disposition of the Kshatri. Here, Krishna just demonstrates the duty of a Kshatriya. The problem, namely of what Varn is, and how a man of inferior Varn can by his conduct gradually elevate himself to a higher class, is repeatedly taken up and resolved at the very end of the sacred composition. Krishna says that he has created the four Varn. Did he in doing so divide men into four classes or castes? He himself says that it was not so. He has only divided action into four categories according to the innate property. So we have to see what that action is, which has thus been divided. Properties are variable. The correct mode of worship can elevate one from the lowest property of ignorance to that of passion and moral blindness, and thence to virtue or the quality of goodness. So through gradual cultivation of the inherent property, any individual can evolve himself into a Brahmin. He is then possessed of all the qualities that are essential to the attainment of and union with the Supreme Spirit. Krishna lays down that even if the inherent ability by which a man participates in this dharma is of the unmeritorious and ignorant Shudra level, it is beneficial in the highest sense because it is the starting point from where he can set out on the path of self-cultivation. However, the worshipper is destroyed if he imitates the manner of higher classes. Arjuna is a worshipper of the Kshatri class. That is why Krishna enjoins him to remember his ability to wage war, because through it he will know that irresolution and grief are unworthy of him. There is no better task than this for a Kshatri. Clarifying the point further, the Yogeshwar says,
Yadrichaya chopapannam swargadvaramapavritam sukhinah kshatriyah partha labhante yuddhamidrisham.
Blessed indeed, O Parth, are the Kshatri who, without seeking, come upon such a war which is like an open door to heaven. The perfect marksman, Arjuna, has made a chariot of the temporal body itself. Only the most fortunate among Kshatri get an opportunity to fight in a war of righteousness that provides fighters with an open gateway to heaven. The worshipper of the Kshatri class is strong enough to subdue all the three properties of matter. The door to heaven is open to him because he has stored an abundance of divine riches in his heart. he is qualified for the enjoyment of celestial existence. This is the open way to heaven. Only the fortunate among the Kshatriya, the ones who have the capacity to wage war, are able to know the significance of the incessant struggle that goes on between matter and spirit. There are wars in the world. People assemble at a place and fight. But even victors in these wars fail to secure a lasting victory. These wars are, in fact, only acts of getting satisfaction by deliberately inflicting injury for injuries inflicted, mere acts of vengeance. The more a man suppresses others, the more he is eventually suppressed himself. What kind of victory is this, in which there is only sense-withering grief? And at the end, the body is also destroyed. The really beneficial war is the conflict between matter and spirit, for a single conquest in this war results in domination of matter by the self. This is a conquest after which there is no possibility of defeat.
अथ चेत्त्वमिमं धर्म्यं संग्रामं न करिष्यसि ततः स्वधर्मं कीर्तिं च हित्वा पापमवाप्स्यसि.
And if you do not engage in this righteous war, you will lose the dharma of yourself and glory, and be guilty of sin. If Arjuna does not fight in this war of matter and spirit, which will afford him access to the Supreme Spirit, to the immutable, eternal Dharma, he will be deprived of his inherent capacity for action and struggle, and wallow in the mire of repeated birth and death, and of disgrace. Krishna then clarifies the nature of this disgrace.
अकीर्तिं चापि भूतानि कथयिष्यन्ति ते व्ययाम् सम्भावितस्य चाकीर्तिः मरणादतिरिच्यते.
And all will forever speak of your disgrace, and such disgrace is worse than death itself for a man of honor. People will long speak ill of Arjuna's unmanliness. Even today, sages like Vishwamitar, Parashar, Nimi, and Shringi are remembered chiefly for their transgressions of the path of righteousness. So worshippers reflect on their dharma. They think about what others will say of them. Such thought is helpful in the process of spiritual seeking. It provides the urge for persevering with the quest for the ultimate reality. It also provides support over a certain length of the spiritual way. Infamy is even worse than death for honorable men.
भयाद्रणादुपरतं मौस्यन्ते त्वां महारथाः येषां च त्वं बहुमतो भूत्वा यास्यसि लाघवम्.
Even the great warriors who have a high regard for you will then scorn you for having turned your back upon the war out of fear. The mighty warriors, in whose esteem Arjuna will then fall from honor to dishonor, will believe that he had retreated from the war due to cowardice. Who are these other great warriors? They too are seekers who make their way strenuously along the path of spiritual realization. The other formidable warriors who oppose them are, on the contrary, desire for sensual pleasure, anger, greed, and attachment, that drag the worshipper with equal tenacity towards ignorance. Arjuna will be disgraced in the eyes of the very people who now hold him in high esteem as a worthy seeker. Apart from this,
अवाच्यवादांश्च बहून् वदिष्यन्ति तवाहिताः निन्दन्तस्तव सामर्थ्यम् ततो दुःखतरं नु किम्.
There can be nothing more painful for you than the disparaging and improper words your adversaries will speak against your valor. His enemies will malign Arjuna and utter words about him that should not be spoken. A single blemish is sufficient to bring upon one a shower of slander and abuse from all directions. Even words improper for speech are spoken. Can there be a greater grief than being an object of such calumny? So Krishna tells Arjuna,
Hato va prapsyasi swargam jitva va bhokshase mahim tasmaduttishta kaunteya yuddhaya krita nishchaya.
Rise up with determination for the war, because if you die in it, you will attain to heaven, and if you win, you will attain to the most exalted glory. If Arjuna loses his life in the war, he will go to heaven and be with Swar, the indestructible God. The impulses that guide one towards the world of matter that is external to the self will be retarded, and his heart will then overflow with the divine qualities that enable one to realize the Supreme Spirit. In case he wins, however, he will attain to the state of redemption, the noblest accomplishment. So Krishna exhorts Arjuna to get up determinedly and prepare for war. Usually, by the verse under examination, it is understood that if Arjuna dies in the war, he will be privileged to live in heaven, but that if he is victorious, he will be rewarded with enjoyment of worldly pleasures. But we cannot but remember that Arjuna has told Krishna that in neither a realm made up of all the three worlds, nor even in an Indra-like lordship over gods, can he see the means that can remedy the grief that is wearing out his senses. If he is to achieve only all this, he has said, he will not fight at any cost. Nevertheless, Krishna exhorts him to fight. What greater reward than domination over the earth in case of victory and celestial pleasures in case of defeat does Krishna promise Arjuna in order to make him fight? Arjuna is, in fact, a disciple aiming at the truth and excellence that lie beyond earthly and heavenly joys. Knowing this, Krishna, the accomplished teacher, tells him that even if the time allotted to his body expires in the course of the war, and he does not succeed in reaching his goal, imbued with divine riches he will gain an existence in Swar, the changeless and eternal. If, on the other hand, he succeeds in the struggle, while his temporal body is still alive, he will achieve the sublimity of God and thus attain to the state of the highest glory. He will thus be a winner both ways. If he conquers, he will attain to the highest state, and if he loses, he will find an abode in heaven and enjoy godly pleasures. There is profit in victory, and there is profit also in defeat. The point is reiterated.
Samadukhe same kritva labha labho jaya jaya tato yuddhaya yujjasva naivam papamavapsyasi.
You will not incur sin if you get up and fight the war, treating victory and defeat, profit and loss, and happiness and sorrow alike. Krishna counsels Arjuna to regard with an equal mind happiness and sorrow, profit and loss, victory and defeat, and to prepare for war. If he participates in the war, he will not be guilty of sin. In the case of success, he will gain the state of sublimity, the most precious possession it is possible for a man to have, and achievement of godhood even in case of defeat. So Arjuna should deliberate well on his gains and losses and prepare for war.
Esha te bhihita sankhye buddhir yoge tvimam shrinu buddhya yukto yaya partha karma bandham prahasyasi.
This knowledge which I have imparted to you, O Parth, is related to GitaYoga, the way of knowledge. And now you should listen to me on KarmaYoga, the way of selfless action, with which you can successfully sever the fetters of action as well as its consequence, karma. Krishna tells Arjuna that the knowledge he has spoken of is related to the way of knowledge. What knowledge is it except that Arjuna should fight? The substance of the way of discrimination or knowledge is only that if we fight according to our disposition, after a careful appraisal of our capacity, as well as of profit and loss, we shall attain to the state of ultimate bliss if we win, and to heavenly godlike existence even if we are vanquished. There is gain in both cases. If we do not act, others will speak disparagingly of us and look upon us as having retreated like cowards, and we shall be disgraced. So to forge ahead on the path of action with a careful understanding of one's innate nature is itself the way of knowledge or discernment. We usually come across the misconception that no war needs to be fought on the path of knowledge. It is said that knowledge involves no action. We think in our vanity, I am pure, I am enlightened, I am a part of God Himself. Accepting it as an axiom that excellence begets excellence, we sit idly. But this is not the way of knowledge, according to Yogeshwar Krishna. The action which has to be performed in following the way of knowledge is similar to that which has to be undertaken for the way of selfless action. The only difference between the two ways is that of attitude. The man who treads the path of knowledge acts with a proper evaluation of his situation and with self-reliance, whereas the man who takes to the path of selfless action also acts, but with reliance upon the mercy of the revered God. Action is a basic requirement of both the ways, and in each of them it is the same, although it has to be done in two different ways. The attitudes behind the action in the two ways are different. So Krishna asks Arjuna to listen to him while he speaks of the way of selfless action, armed with which he can effectively destroy the bonds of action and its consequence. Here, the Yogeshwar has for the first time spoken of karma, although without explaining what it is.
नेहाभिक्रमनाशोऽस्ति प्रत्यवायो न विद्यते स्वल्पमप्यस्य धर्मस्य त्रायते महतो भयात्.
Since selfless action neither wears out the seed from which it sprang, nor has any adverse consequence, even a partial observance of this dharma liberates one from the dire terror of repeated birth and death. In the performance of action without coveting the fruits thereof, the initial impulse or the seed is not destroyed. It also does not give rise to any evil. So selfless action, even though done in small measures, frees us from the great fear represented by birth and death. That necessitates reflecting over the nature of such action and walking at least a few steps along its path. Worshippers who have renounced the vanity of earthly possessions have trodden this path, but so can those who lead the life of householders. Krishna tells Arjuna to just sow the seed, for the seed is never destroyed. There is no power in nature, no weapon which can destroy it. The material world can only cover it up momentarily and hide it for a while, but it cannot wipe out the initial inspiration, the seed of the act of spiritual accomplishment. According to Krishna, even the gravest of sinners can doubtlessly cross over by the arc of knowledge. He means exactly this when he says that if the seed of selfless action is just planted, it is imperishable. It does not even have any adverse outcome insomuch as it does not abandon us midway after showing us how we can progress towards spiritual attainment. Even if we give it up, it works doggedly on for our final liberation. This is why selfless action, even in a small measure, provides freedom from the great dread of birth and death. Once planted, even after repeated birth, the seed of such action takes us to the realization of God and to emancipation alike from pleasure and from pain. The question is, what we have to do if we choose the way of selfless action.
Vyavasayatmika buddhi ekeha kuru nandana bahushakhayanantascha buddhayo vyavasayinam.
On this auspicious path, O Kuru Nandan, Arjuna, the resolute mind is one, but the minds of the ignorant are divided and many. The mind, which is earnestly and firmly oriented to selfless action, is unified. Selfless action is only one, and its outcome is also one. Spiritual accomplishment is the only true achievement. The gradual realization of this attainment, by fighting against forces of the material world, is an enterprise. This enterprise and resolute action with a single goal are also one and the same. Then what about those who propagate more than one mode of action? In Krishna's view, they are not true worshippers. The minds of such men are endlessly divided, and that is why they conjure up endless ways.
Yamimam pushpitam vacham pravadantya vipaschitah vedavadarata partha nanyadastiti vadinah kamatmana svargapara janma karma phalapradam kriya vishesha bahulam bhogaishvarya gatim prati.
Desire-ridden men, O Parth, who are given only to listening to Vedic promises of rewards for action, who believe that the attainment of heaven is the highest goal of temporal birth and its activities, and who speak pretentious words to describe the many rites and ceremonies that they regard as conducive to the achievements of worldly pleasure and power, are ignorant and bereft of discernment. The minds of such men are riddled with endless dissensions, covetous and attached to the tempting promises made by Vedic verses, They regard heaven as the most sublime goal, and they believe in nothing beyond this. Such ignorant men not only devise numerous rites and ceremonies, the performance of which is expected to bring such rewards as the next birth, sensual enjoyment, and worldly dominion, but also flaunt them in flowery and affected language. To put it differently, the minds of men without discrimination have infinite divisions. They are addicted to precepts which promise fruits of action and accept the pledges of the Ved as final and authoritative. They regard heaven as the highest goal. Because their minds are split by many differences, they invent numerous modes of worship. They do speak of God, but behind the cover of His name, they build up a whole multitude of ritual ceremonies. Now, are these activities not a form of action? Krishna denies that these activities are true action. What then is true action? The question remains unanswered at this point. For the time being, Krishna only states that ignorant minds are divided minds, because of which they formulate an unlimited number of rites and ceremonies that are not real action. They not only expound them, but also give utterance to them in figurative language. Let us now see the effect of all this.
Bhogaishvarya prasaktanam taya parhita chetasam vyavasayatmika buddhi samadhau na vidhiyate.
Delighted by ornamental words and attached to worldly pleasures and dominance, men without discrimination have irresolute minds. Minds which are affected by the tempting words of such people are also corrupted, and they also fail to accomplish what is worthwhile. The people whose minds are enamored of such words, and who are attached to sensual enjoyment and temporal power, are deprived of their capacity for action. They are bereft of resolve for the true action that is a prerequisite of contemplation of the worshipped God. But who are the people that lend their ears to these unwise men? Of course, rather than being knowers of the self within and the Supreme Spirit without, they are the ones who are addicted to sensual pleasure and temporal power. The minds of such men are lacking in will for the action that is needed for the ultimate union of the Self with the Supreme Spirit. What exactly is the meaning of the assertion that they too are mistaken who are blindly devoted to Vedic pronouncements? Krishna speaks about this.
Traigunya Vishaya Veda Nistraigunyo Bhavarjuna Nirdvandvo Nitya Sattvasto Niryogakshema Atmavan.
Since all the Ved, O Arjun, only illumine the three properties, you should rise above them. Be free from the contradictions of happiness and sorrow. Rest on that which is constant, and be unconcerned with getting what you do not have, as well as with protecting what you do have, in order to dedicate yourself to the self within. The Ved only illumine the three properties of nature. They know nothing of what is beyond them. So Arjuna should go beyond the sphere of action laid down by the Ved. How to do this? Krishna advises Arjuna to liberate himself from the conflicts of joy and sorrow, concentrate on the one changeless reality, and desire neither the unobtained nor the obtained, so that he may devote himself single-mindedly to the indwelling self. This is how he can rise above the Ved. But is there any precedence of anyone going beyond them? Krishna says that as a man transcends the Ved, even so he comes face to face with the Supreme Spirit, and that the man who is aware of him is a true Vipra, a Brahman.
यावानर्थ उदपाने सर्वतः सम्प्लुतोदके तावान् सर्वेषु वेदेषु ब्राह्मणस्य विजानतः.
After the final absolution, a man does not need the Ved, just as we do not need a pond when there is the all-stretching ocean around. When a man is surrounded by the ocean on all sides, he has no use for a pond. Just so, a Brahman who has gained knowledge of the Supreme Spirit has no use for the Ved. That means that the one who knows God transcends the Ved, and that man is a Brahman. So Krishna counsels Arjuna to rise above the Ved and be a Brahman. Arjuna is a Kshatriya, and Krishna is exhorting him to be a Brahman. Brahman and Kshatriya are, among others, names of qualities that are inherent in the dispositions of different Varna, or what are now more commonly known as castes. But the Varna tradition is originally, as we have already seen, action-oriented, rather than a social provision determined by birth. What use has he for a petty pond who has availed himself of the crystal current of the Ganga? Some use a pond for ablution, while others wash their cattle in it. A sage who has known God by direct perception has the same kind of use for the Ved. They are undoubtedly useful. The Ved exists for stragglers who lag behind. Further elucidation of the problem begins from this point. Subsequently, Krishna expounds the precautions to be observed in the performance of action.
कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन मा कर्मफलहेतुर्भुर्मा ते सङ्गोऽस्त्वकर्मणि.
Since you are entitled only to the performance of action, but never to the fruits thereof, you should neither desire rewards of action, nor be drawn to inaction. Arjuna, Krishna says, has the right to action, but not to its results. So Arjuna should persuade himself that fruits of action simply do not exist. He should not covet these fruits, and neither should he grow disillusioned with action. So far, Krishna has first used the term action, karma, meaning both action and its consequence, in the 39th verse of the chapter, but he has not indicated what this karma is and how to perform it. He has, however, described its characteristic traits. First, he has told Arjuna that by the performance of action, he will be freed from the bonds of action. Second, he has then said that the seed or initial impulse of action is indestructible. Once it is initiated, nature has no means to destroy it. Third, there is, Arjuna has been told, not even the slightest flaw in this action, for it never abandons us while we are stranded amidst the temptations of celestial pleasures and worldly affluence. Fourth, performance of this action, even in small proportions, can emancipate us from the great fear of birth and death. But As is evident from the summary above, Krishna has not so far defined action. As for the way of doing it, he has said in the 41st verse, "The mind which is resolved to do this action is only one, and the way of doing it is also only one." Does it mean then that people engaged in other multifarious activities are not really engaged in the worship of God? According to Krishna, the activities of such people are not action. Explaining why it is so, he adds that the minds of men without discernment are riven by endless divisions, because of which they tend to invent and elaborate an unlimited number of rites and ceremonies. So they are not true worshippers. They use pretentious and ornate language to describe these rites and ceremonies. So that man's mind is also poisoned who is lured by the charm of their words. The ordained action is therefore only one, although we have not yet been told what precisely it is. In the 47th verse, Krishna has told Arjuna that he has a right to action but not to its fruits. So Arjuna should not desire these fruits. At the same time, he ought not to lose faith in the performance of action. In other words, he should be constantly and devotedly engaged in its performance. But Krishna has not yet said what this action is. Verse is usually interpreted as meaning, "Do whatever you wish, only do not desire its fruits." That is, say those who interpret the verse thus, what selfless action is all about. In fact, however, Krishna has not so far told us what this action is that men are required to do. He has so far elaborated only its characteristics, what the gains from it are, and the precautions that have to be observed in the course of its performance. Yet the question of what exactly selfless action is has so far remained unanswered. It is, in fact, answered only in chapters 3 and 4. Krishna again reverts to what he has already said.
योगस्थः कुरु कर्माणि संगं त्यक्त्वा धनञ्जय सिद्ध्यसिद्ध्योः समो भूत्वा समत्वं योग उच्यते.
The equipoise of mind that arises from profound absorption in the performance of action, after renouncing attachment and being even-minded in respect of success and failure, is, O Dhananjay, Arjuna, given the name of Yoga. Resting in Yoga, renouncing infatuation for worldly ties, and looking at success and failure with an equal mind, Arjuna should undertake action. But what action? Krishna's pronouncement is that men should do selfless action. Equipoise of mind is what is called yoga. The mind in which there is no unevenness is full of equanimity. Greed destroys its evenness, attachments make it unequal, and desire for the fruits of action destroy its serenity. That is why there should be no hankering after the fruits of action. At the same time, however, there should also be no diminishing of faith in the performance of action. Renouncing attachment to all things, seen as well as unseen, and giving up all concern about achievement and non-achievement, we should only keep our eyes fixed on yoga, the discipline that joins the individual soul with the Supreme Spirit, and lead a life of strenuous action. Yoga is thus the state of culmination, but it is also the initial stage. At the outset, our eyes should be fixed on the goal. It is for this reason that we should act keeping our eyes on yoga. Equanimity of mind is also named Yoga. When the mind cannot be shaken by failure and success, and nothing can destroy its evenness, it is said to be in the state of Yoga.